Hi, everybody. I'm Chuck, and this is my good friend Mark from Oklahoma City, soon to be New York City. So, what are we doing today, Mark?
Yeah, so we've been story by story working our way through the book of Acts and learning as we go what we can discern and pull out of the text from the disciple maker's perspective. And so this week we're in Acts 9 and continuing on with this story of Saul and then a little bit of Peter.
All right, so here we go, starting with verse 20.
So the word of the Lord was growing mightily and prevailing. Now, after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, "After I have been there, I must also see Rome." And having sent into Macedonia two of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. After that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades and said, "Men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. Not only is there danger that this trade of ours falls into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she, whom all of Asia and the world worship, will even be dethroned from her magnificence." When they heard this and were filled with rage, they began crying out, saying, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. And when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. Also, some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theater. So then, some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion. The majority did not know for what reason they had come together. Some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, and having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry arose from them all as they shouted for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." After quieting the crowd, the town clerk said, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there after all who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell from heaven? So, since these are undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess. So then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session and proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in the lawful assembly. For indeed, we are in danger of becoming accused of a riot in connection with today's events, since there is no real cause for it. And in this connection, we will be unable to account for this disorderly gathering." After saying this, he dismissed the assembly.
All right, so there's a lot there, and Paul the troublemaker is creating quite the brouhaha. So, as it relates to disciple making, what jumps out to you, Mark?
Uh, I think in raising up so Paul is tested at this point. Here we are in just later in his ministry, but he's been tested at this point. And I think one of the things that I remember early on in his journey is in Cyprus, when he comes against the fear of man, and he chooses not to let this guy who's speaking out, this false prophet, derail the ministry. He stands up and he declares that this is the kingdom, and it's about Jesus. And so from that point on, I think he kind of had confronted that spirit of the fear of man. And so here, what I see, one of the things I see is he's coming in and boldly proclaiming Christ, and it stirs up a whole lot of principalities, probably, and just demons in the place, so that the gospel can be proclaimed and really see who's on the side of the Lord and who's not. So I guess from the disciple perspective, how key that is that leaders deal with that and then be bold and understand that it's our job to stir things up and then let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, and we really see this pattern over and over again. Even, our great example, Jesus, we see the word being sown, growth, and then persecution. And then more word and more persecution, more growth. I like verse 20. It says, "So the word of the Lord was growing mightily and prevailing." And it reminds me of Matthew 16:18, where Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." And this is an offensive war, not a defensive war. Gates are for keeping people out, and the gates of hell can't hold the church back. And that's what we see happening here. So is it any wonder that we should see conflict, so
I also see here, Chuck, there's this moment where they're preaching and confusion begins to happen among the people. And I think, honestly, I don't know what, I'd love to hear your perspective here, but it seems like the wisdom of God that they're holding Paul back from going into this whole thing, because when there's a bunch of confusion, we're not trying to explain the gospel to people. We're proclaiming it, but when there's people don't even know why they're there, that's not a crowd you want to really be standing in front of. So the clerk comes in and brings some order and all of that. But yeah, it seems like some wisdom there.
Yeah. And when I was in the Army, in fact, part of an elite group of soldiers, Rangers, we had a saying, "Run, run, run away, come and fight another day," And even Jesus says, when you're persecuted in this city, leave and go to the next. Yeah. And so there is a fine line between hardcore and stupid. Don't be stupid, and that's what these elders were doing. They were being wise,
Yeah.
So I completely agree. Let's come and fight another day, so. Anything else jump out at you?
Yeah, those are the big things. I think I'm struck by, you mentioned just the pattern of Jesus, and I think you've got to, it seems like, I'll put it this way, that when the gospel goes to new people and new places, it usually has to create chaos so that it can bring order. And so from that disciple maker's perspective, to just understand, sometimes you got to go in and you got to be the bull in the china shop and break things up so that you can find out who's really a follower and who's not. So not to avoid the conflict or avoid the shaking that happens.
Yeah. And sometimes, I think we talked about this last time, sometimes the most violent protesters become the best followers, i.e. Paul,
That's right.
Yeah, so it does take a little bit of shaking sometimes to get things moving. And as long as we're using biblical principles as our reasoning for what we do, a lot of times people get emotional and then they lose reason, and we always have to use the scriptures for our foundation and Jesus for our foundation. What would Jesus say? What would Jesus do in these circumstances? So
good.
good lessons for today. All right. We love you. God bless you. And until next time, keep following Jesus.